Welcome back to part 2 of chapter 5, the American Revolution. We'll continue talking about the effects of the revolution on the United States. Let's start with the economic effects of the American Revolution. During the war, many loyalists lost their property and were forced to flee to Canada or England to avoid being put in jail. The second economic effect of the American Revolution is that it brought an end to mercantilism and began a new form of economic system known as capitalism. The American colonies no longer had to contribute to England, and so they could be able to create a new economic system that could benefit themselves. The third economic effect is that this produced an industrial revolution in England. It forced the British to begin to grow their industry and create a more industrial society. And finally, the economic effect was on the Native Americans, or the American Indians, who were pushed further west, who lost more land. They lost the land between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains. That was one of the reasons why American Indians supported the British in the American Revolution. Next, let's talk about the social effects. Many of these were tested on the 2020 AP exam. Over 100,000 loyalists ended up fleeing the country, going to either Canada or England. This also caused the Anglican Church to lose a lot of its support. In turn, it strengthened the Catholic Church in America as there became more religious diversity. Socially, African Americans began to push for more liberty. The American Revolution also led to an increase in women's rights. Many states made divorce much easier, granted more educational opportunities, and property rights to women. It also created the concept of what we're going to call Republican motherhood, or the cult of domesticity. The idea that women have a specific role in American society. We'll talk more about that later on. And it also ended the idea of primogeniture, or entails, the idea that you only give your firstborn your inheritance. The keys to a successful republic. The keys to the successful republic are going to be liberty and order, civic virtue, education, law and order, and Republican motherhood. Virtue was the health of the soul. It was the only true foundation of a republic. Citizens had to be willing to put their own interests below those of the community. Americans were expected to be frugal, industrious, sober, and simple. Franklin's self-improvement. These traits were necessary for the survival of the republic. Man must also avoid debt. Debt meant giving up liberty and giving up freedom. Debt was seen as a cancer. It was treated as an enormous worry among the founding fathers. Americans were to be a self-sufficient, independent, and land-holding people. But how do you promote a Republican citizenry? How do you promote virtue? It was necessary to have citizens schooled in the new Republican education. You must be educated to be a Republican citizen to offset monarchy education. Penitentiaries were invented in the late 1700s. It was necessary to reform criminals. Before the 1800s, criminals were not sentenced to jail time. They were fined, whipped, publicly humiliated. A Republican citizenry tried to reform bad behavior and not accept it. Discipline was stressed and not tortured. Women were to be the cornerstone of the republic. They were responsible for their children's education. They would become the teachers. Women embodied liberty more than men. Power was male, liberty and virtue was female. As a result of this greater social role for women, women's status changed as well. Family size decreased as mothers realized nursing kept them from getting pregnant. Divorce rates went up as marriage was no longer a bond between master and servant, but a reciprocal union of interests. Child custody in the 1800s passed to mothers, whereas before the father was given custody since property was inherited through the male line. Relationships became more loving. Parent-child relationships changed as physical beatings were no longer acceptable. Breaking a child's spirit was no longer acceptable. These paintings even reveal a different relationship between the father and his children. He's no longer standing aloof and away from his wife and children, but engaged with them as you compare the paintings on the left and on the right. Women's role in society was altered by the American Revolution. Women who ran households in the absence of men became more assertive. Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, became an early advocate of women's rights when she prompted her husband to remember the ladies when drawing up a new government. Pre-revolutionary ministers, particularly in Puritan Massachusetts, preached the moral superiority of men. Enlightened thinkers rejected this and knew that a republic could only succeed if its citizens were virtuous and educated. Who were the primary caretakers of American children? American women. If the republic were to succeed, women must be schooled in virtue so they could teach their children. The first American female academies were founded in the 1790s. This idea of an educated woman became known as Republican motherhood. John Dickinson believed that once the Revolutionary War was over, the country had to unite itself into one government. He believed the republic was the best form of government to unite the country. He meant small r Republican, or republicanism. The moral code of conduct was a set of behavioral expectations for the citizens. Paine said the republic meant the public good of the whole. This was the object of government. The individual must suppress their self-interests. The community must become before the individual. So, republicanism, with a small r, means popular sovereignty, the control of the people, a limited government, a representative government, in which representatives represent the people, individual rights, virtue, patriotism. Two famous quotes that represent republicanism is one from Jefferson and one from Adams. Jefferson says a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% can take away the rights of the other 49. Now let's look at the political effects of the American Revolution. On the government side, state constitutions were created with strong legislators and popularly elected governors. Remember that governors in the past had been selected by the king. The national government, or the Articles of Confederation, created a weak central government. The republic will replace the monarchy, which will lead to a separation of church and state. When it comes to voting, many states lowered their property requirements, allowing more people to vote, and many eliminated their religious qualifications. In the realm of foreign affairs, France unfortunately was bankrupt by supporting the American Revolution, which in turn led to the French Revolution. The American Revolution also inspired other European colonies to overthrow their rulers, for example, Haiti and Toussaint de l'Ouverture. One of the most important effects of the Revolution was the impact on slavery. Slavery overall was abolished in the North. Manumission, or the process of freeing your slaves, was made much easier, and post-natty laws were passed, leading to gradual emancipation. North American colonies had rules for manumission passed by their legislators. African slaves were freed in the colonies as early as the 17th century. After the Revolutionary War, individual states will pass laws governing these transactions, making it easier to accomplish. After the war, states passed laws allowing slaveholders to declare slaves free by filing papers. Numerous manumissions were made in the idealism of the war. The percentage of free blacks as a proportion of the total black population increased in the Upper South from less than 1% to nearly 10%. Together with several northern states abolishing slavery during this period, the percentage of free blacks nationally increased to 13.5% of the total black population. Post-natty, what that means is born after. This term is applied to persons who came to reside in the United States after the Declaration of Independence. They are generally considered aliens unless they become naturalized or otherwise so declared by law. Okay, now let's talk about the Articles of Confederation and its governmental structure. The Articles of Confederation is a loose alliance of all 13 original states. The states have independent political authority and they hold every power that's not specifically given to Congress. Each state will send between 2 and 7 representatives to Congress. There'll be a one-house assembly. Every state has equal representation. They have 1 vote each. And if you want to pass a law, you have to have 9 states agree. If they want to make any type of amendment to the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states must approve. There is no real executive authority in the Articles of Confederation, and there exists no real judicial branch. The Land Ordinance of 1785 was adopted by the United States Congress on May 20th, 1785. It set up a standardized system whereby settlers could purchase title to farmland in the undeveloped West. Congress at the time did not have the power to raise revenue by direct taxation, so land sales provided an important revenue stream. The ordinance set up a survey system that eventually covered over 3/4 of the area of the continental United States. The ordinance was also significant for establishing a mechanism for funding public education. Section 16 in each township was reserved for the maintenance of public schools. Many schools today are still located in Section 16 of their respective townships, although a great many of the school sections were sold to raise money for public education. 2 years later, the Northwest Ordinance proposed that 3 to 5 new states be created from the Northwest Territory. Instead of adopting the legal constructs of an existing state, each territory would have an appointed governor and council. When the population reached 5,000, the residents could elect their own assembly, although the governor would retain absolute veto power. When 60,000 settlers resided in a territory, they could draft a constitution and petition for full statehood. The ordinance provided for civil liberties and public education within the new territories, but did not allow slavery. Pro-slavery Southerners were willing to go along with this because they hoped that the new states would be populated by white settlers from the South. They believed that although these Southerners would have no slaves of their own, they would not join the growing abolition movement of the North. Although the 1783 Treaty of Paris ceded control of the Northwest Territory to the United States, the British failed to abandon their forts in the region and continued to support their Indian allies in skirmishes with American settlers. At the Battle of Fallen Timbers on August 20th, 1794, General Anthony Wayne led American troops to a decisive victory against a confederation of Native Americans whose leaders included Chief Little Turtle of the Miami, Chief Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, and Chief Bucongolus of the Lenape. The fighting took place on the Maumee River near present-day Toledo. With the Treaty of Greenville, signed in present-day Greenville, Ohio in August of 1795, the Indians ceded much of present-day Ohio, which in 1803 became America's 17th state. By the terms of the treaty, the Indians also ceded parts of Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. In 1786 and 1787, Daniel Shays led a large rebellion with its members wearing sprigs of evergreen, just as the Sons of Liberty had a few years before. They shut down the courthouses and attempted to seize the arsenal at Springfield. The real threat was that this rebellion could spread to other states. There was a threat to order. Had the government given the people too much liberty? The Massachusetts State Militia at first refused to go after Shays. The Continental Army was eventually used to put down the rebellion. The government had now become as oppressive as Parliament and the King. The specter of Shays' rebellion sparked a debate over the framing of a new U.S. Constitution, providing fuel to Alexander Hamilton and other Federalists who advocated for a stronger federal government and diminished states' rights. Nationalists used the rebellion to heighten paranoia, and George Washington was convinced enough by their arguments to come out of retirement and take part in the Constitutional Convention, where he was elected the first president of the United States. When the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention began, many communities in Massachusetts that supported the rebellion sent delegates that had taken part in it.